My vampire boss loved me in silence, until the night he showed up drunk at my door. The coffee was bitter, but I drank it anyway. Office coffee always was, a murky brown liquid that had probably been sitting in the pot since dawn. I sat at my desk on the 42nd floor of Blackthorn Industries, watching the city lights flicker on as dusk settled over Manhattan. Another Friday night, another weekend of doing absolutely nothing. My job as an executive assistant wasn't glamorous, but it paid well. More importantly, it paid for my tiny apartment in Hell's Kitchen and the occasional therapy session I desperately needed to process my embarrassing life choices. "These reports need to be compiled by morning," a voice said behind me. I didn't flinch. I'd learned long ago not to react to Adrian Blackthorn's sudden appearances. My boss had an uncanny ability to materialize out of nowhere, silent as a ghost. It was just one of his many unsettling qualities. I turned in my swivel chair to face him. Adrian stood in the doorway of his office, silhouetted against the soft glow of his private workspace. He was the kind of beautiful that made people uncomfortable, chiseled features, pale skin that seemed to glow under fluorescent lights, and eyes so dark they looked black. Those eyes were currently fixed on the spreadsheet I'd been working on, though I had the distinct feeling he was looking at something else entirely. "Of course, Mr. Blackthorn," I replied, keeping my voice professional. He didn't leave immediately. That was unusual. Adrian was efficient to the point of being robotic. He gave orders and left. He didn't linger. He didn't make small talk. He certainly didn't stand in doorways like he was wrestling with something internal. "You worked through lunch again," he said. "It wasn't a question." "There's a lot to do," I answered carefully. "You should take care of yourself." His voice had changed, softening slightly. "You look tired." I felt heat creep up my neck. Adrian Blackthorn had never commented on my appearance beyond noting whether I was dressed appropriately for client meetings. The office rumor mill had it that he was ice cold, that he'd never been seen on a date, that he'd fired someone once for making a personal phone call during work hours. "I'm fine," I said, "just end-of-week exhaustion." He nodded slowly, his dark eyes lingering on mine for a moment longer than necessary. "Don't stay too late." Then he was gone, disappearing back into his office like he'd never been there. I sat in the quiet aftermath, my heart doing something strange against my ribs. This was new. In the 3 years I'd worked for Adrian, he'd maintained perfect distance. Professional, cordial but cold. He was a puzzle I'd stopped trying to solve about 6 months into the job, when I realized that staying in this perpetual state of wondering about him was only making me miserable. Besides, I was his employee. He was a high-powered CEO with a reputation for ruthlessness. Anything I felt was just a product of working in close proximity to someone powerful and attractive. It would pass. It had to pass. I stayed until 9 o'clock, finishing the reports Adrian had requested. The office was empty by then. The cleaning crew had come and gone, and the building had taken on that eerie quiet that only high-rise buildings could achieve. My footsteps echoed as I walked to Adrian's office, dropping the completed reports on his desk. For a moment I stood in his space. His office was minimalist, expensive furniture, a view that cost more than my annual salary and very little personal decoration. A single photograph sat on his desk, face down. I'd always wondered what it was, but I'd never been brave enough to look. Tonight I almost did, almost reached down and turned it over, almost did something completely inappropriate that would have gotten me fired. Instead, I left it alone, closed his office door quietly and headed home. Monday morning came too fast. I'd spent my weekend alone, doing laundry and watching Netflix, trying not to think about the moment Adrian had stopped in my doorway and called me tired. But the thing about ignoring something is that it has a way of becoming impossible to ignore. The following week I noticed things, small things. Adrian started leaving coffee on my desk, the expensive kind from the Italian place down the street, not the office swill. He began asking how my weekend was, lingering for my answers. During team meetings, I'd catch him looking at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Twice, I'd turned too quickly and found him staring, only for him to glance away with something that looked almost like embarrassment. By Wednesday, my friend Jessica was convinced he was interested. "Are you insane?" I hissed at her during our lunch break. We were sitting in the break room on the 39th floor, which had decent views but always smelled like someone's reheated fish. He's my boss, he's untouchable, and he's Adrian Blackthorne. He probably doesn't even understand human emotion. Jessica laughed, nearly spilling her diet soda. Oh my God, you have it so bad. I don't have anything. You're sitting here defending a man you've convinced yourself is a robot. That's romantic denial, my friend. That's love. It's not love, I snapped. It's nothing. He's probably just being nice. Maybe he's trying to improve employee morale. He fired Brendan from accounting because Brendan smiled too much at a client meeting, Jessica said pointedly. He's not nice, so if he's suddenly leaving you expensive coffee and asking about your personal life, something has changed. I didn't have an argument for that. The situation escalated on Friday. Adrian called me into his office around 4 o'clock, which wasn't unusual, but when I entered, I found him standing by the window instead of sitting at his desk. His jacket was off, his sleeves rolled up. I'd never seen him like that. Adrian was always buttoned up, always controlled. I'm considering promoting you, he said without preamble. I stopped walking. I'm sorry. Senior executive assistant, more responsibility, better pay, your own office on this floor. He finally looked at me, and there was something vulnerable in his expression. But it would mean seeing more of me, working longer hours, being involved in my personal scheduling as well as my professional one. Mr. Blackthorne. Adrian, he interrupted. I'd prefer it if you called me Adrian, outside of formal meetings at least. This was wrong. This was crossing lines. This was everything my HR training had warned me about. My boss shouldn't be offering me promotions while his sleeves were rolled up and his guard was clearly down. That's very kind of you, I said carefully, but I'm happy with my current position. His jaw tightened. Is it because of me? The question hung in the air between us, dangerous and loaded with things we both wanted to say but hadn't. I don't know what you mean, I lied. Yes, you do. He turned fully to face me. You know exactly what I mean, you feel it. The same way I feel it every time you're in a room with me, the same way I've been fighting to feel less of it for the past 3 years. My throat went dry. Adrian, I can't. I'm not asking you to do anything right now, he said quietly. I'm just asking you to consider the promotion, to consider possibility. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. Adrian's phone followed. We both checked them automatically, pulled back to professionalism by the alert. You should go, he said, his voice cool again like someone had flipped a switch. It's Friday, enjoy your weekend. Adrian, please go. I left, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might crack ribs. That weekend I did something stupid. I googled Adrian Blackthorne. The headlines were what you'd expect. Business magnate, hostile takeovers, a reputation for ruthlessness that had only grown over the past decade. Photos showed him at charity events, always impeccably dressed, always surrounded by powerful people, always looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. But there were older articles too, from 15, 20, even 25 years ago, and they all had the same haunting detail. Adrian Blackthorne looked identical in every single photo. Same face, same age, same everything. I told myself it was just good genetics, perfect lighting, expensive skin care. I didn't tell myself what I actually suspected. By Sunday night, I'd convinced myself to turn down the promotion. I'd draft a polite email, thank him for the opportunity, explain that I was happy as I was. Professional distance would be maintained. The moment would pass. Except moments like that don't just pass. They fester. It was 2 a.m. on Tuesday when Adrian showed up at my apartment. I knew it was him the moment my security buzzer rang. Only one person would come to my building at this hour, and that person didn't exist in the reasonable world I'd been trying to construct. I buzzed him in anyway. When I opened my apartment door, Adrian was standing in my hallway soaking wet, his white dress shirt plastered to his chest, his dark hair dripping onto my welcome mat. He looked like someone had hauled him out of the ocean. His eyes were wild, unfocused, and he was holding a bottle of whiskey that was clearly not full anymore. Hi, he said, the word slurred slightly. I was in the neighborhood. You're drunk, I stated. Very drunk, he agreed. Can I come in? Your building has excellent security, by the way. That should make you feel safe. I respect that, safety. I should have closed the door. Any reasonable person would have. Adrian was my boss, he was intoxicated, and he was standing in my hallway like a drowning man. But I'd never been reasonable about Adrian, so I stepped aside. He stumbled into my apartment, a studio barely big enough for a bed and a kitchenette, and collapsed onto my couch like his strings had been cut. Why are you wet? I asked, closing the door. Went swimming, he held up the whiskey bottle. In the East River. Do you know what's in the East River? Everything. Garbage, history, broken dreams. I swam through all of it. Adrian, what happened to you? What happened to me? He laughed, a broken sound. What happened is that I'm a coward. A 300-year-old coward who's finally met someone he wants to be honest with, and he's too terrified to do it without getting drunk first. The room seemed to tilt. 300 years, he finished for me. Not going to bother denying it. You've already figured it out, haven't you? That's the thing about you, you see. Most people look but don't see, you actually look. I sat down on the edge of my coffee table, directly across from him. You're a vampire. Incredibly unhelpful term, he said, pointing the bottle at me. Suggests capes and sparkles and an obsession with small woodland creatures. I'm just a man who made a very stupid decision in 1724 and now he can't die. Do you know what the worst part is? I shook my head. Loving someone for 3 years and not being able to tell her because she might run screaming from her apartment, which, let's be honest, she should. I'm a monster. I drink blood. Not people blood before you ask. I'm ethical about it, synthetic mostly, which is boring but moral. I've lived long enough to know that human relationships are temporary and devastating because humans are fragile and time is cruel. He took another drink. But then you smiled at me on a Tuesday during a board meeting, and I realized I didn't care anymore. I was willing to be vulnerable, to be known, to be hurt. Adrian, you're going to tell me this is inappropriate, he continued. That I'm your boss and this is sexual harassment or whatever the modern term is. You're going to tell me that I need to go home and we'll deal with this professionally in the morning. And you'd be right. You'd be completely right. But I wanted one night. One night where I told you the truth and you didn't leave immediately. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt something crack open inside my chest. You're not a monster, I said quietly. Adrian's eyes focused on me for the first time. You don't know me. I know that you pay your employees fairly. I know that you donate to hospitals even though you never mention it. I know that you shut down that development project that would have destroyed the neighborhood's only community center, and you took the financial hit without blinking. That's not a monster. I did those things because I was trying to be good enough for you, he said roughly, in case you eventually saw me the way I see you. The confession hung between us, honest and raw and terrifying. How do you see me? I asked. Like you're the only real thing I've touched in 100 years, he said. Like you matter more than breathing, except I don't breathe, so that's saying something. Like I'd burn down everything I've built just to hear you laugh. I should have thrown him out. I should have called HR. I should have done 1,000 things that weren't what I did next, which was move to sit beside him on the couch and take his cold, wet hand. Tell me something true, I said. Something besides the vampire thing, something personal. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, my real name isn't Adrian, it's Adrian. I was born female in France, and I spent 40 years as a woman before I decided I was neither and both and everything. I chose Adrian as a name when I chose myself. My favorite food is red wine and whatever fruit is in season. I'm terrified of the ocean because I almost drowned once and it took 200 years to stop having nightmares about it. But I did it anyway, the swimming, because I needed to feel something. I needed to feel alive. I squeezed his hand. Thank you for telling me. You're not going to leave. Not yet, I said, but you're going to sleep, and we're going to have a very complicated conversation in the morning. He fell asleep before I'd finished speaking, his head tilted back against my couch, his hand still clasped in mine. I sat there in the darkness of my apartment, holding a drunk vampire's hand, and wondered how my life had become so beautifully strange. Adrian woke up as dawn was breaking, which was apparently awkward for him. He jerked awake like someone had thrown cold water on him, saw me sitting in the armchair across from him, where I'd migrated around 4 a.m., and seemed to undergo several emotional transformations in quick succession. First came embarrassment, then panic, then resignation. "I'm going to resign," he announced. "This is inappropriate, and I'm your superior, and I clearly took advantage of a late-night situation to—" "No," I interrupted, "to unload my emotional baggage in a completely, sorry what?" "No," I repeated, "you're not resigning. That's the coward's way out, and you just spent a lot of last night telling me you're not a coward." He sat up slowly, running his hands through his hair. In the morning light he looked different, softer somehow, despite still being soaking wet. His dress shirt had started to dry in strange patterns, creating a map of the East River across his body. "You should be calling the police," he said. "Or a priest, or I don't know what your cultural background is. A rabbi. What does one do when their boss turns out to be a supernatural creature?" "One makes coffee and asks questions," I said, standing up. "Do you like coffee? Can you drink coffee?" "I can drink anything except for the things that would kill a normal person," he said slowly. "Coffee is fine. It doesn't taste like anything, but I can drink it." I made coffee. We sat at my tiny kitchen counter, two people separated by one of the biggest secrets in human history, trying to navigate small talk. "So," I said finally, "tell me how you died." Adrian took a sip of coffee that clearly tasted like nothing. "I was stabbed by my lover's husband in 1724. He found us together. I bled out in an alley in Marseille, and then I woke up 3 days later in a vampire's nest. Apparently I had good bones or something. I don't really remember much. It was all very gothic and dramatic." "Did you want it, the transformation?" "God, no," he said. "I was furious for about 100 years. But then things started to change. I learned that immortality was better spent building something than lamenting what I'd lost. I made my money through some very creative investments once the stock market became a thing. I built a company. I found a routine. I found a life." "And then what?" "And then you walked into my office on a Tuesday morning, carrying 3 coffees and apologizing because you'd spilled some on your sleeve. You were wearing a blue dress that matched your eyes, and you were so apologetic about the coffee. And I realized that I could live forever and never meet anyone as genuinely kind as you were." My throat felt tight. "Adrian." "I know," he said. "I'm your boss. It's inappropriate. It's unfair because you didn't know and I did. It's unbalanced. I have about 299 years of experience on you, and that's creepy." "Is it still creepy?" I asked, "now that I know?" He looked at me for a long moment. "I don't know. That depends on whether you're going to press charges or file a restraining order." I laughed despite myself. "I'm not going to do either of those things." "Why not?" "Because you're right," I said. "It is creepy, but it's also kind of beautiful in a completely deranged way. You're a centuries-old immortal being who showed up drunk at my apartment instead of just moving on with your life. That's the opposite of what a cold, heartless monster would do." Adrian set down his coffee cup. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Will you be with me only because you're curious about the vampire thing? Because I will understand if that's the case, but I'd rather know now than discover it 10 years from now when the novelty wears off." "No," I said. "I will be with you because 3 years ago you asked how my weekend was, and you actually listened to my answer. I'll be with you because you're brilliant and dangerous and weirdly kind underneath all that ice. I'll be with you because last night you let me see the real you, and the real you is someone I want to know more of. The vampire thing is just the icing on what's already complicated," I finished. He smiled then, and it transformed his whole face. Adrian beautiful was one thing. Adrian genuinely happy was another level entirely. "I need to go home," he said eventually. "I have blood to drink, the synthetic kind, nothing alarming, and I need to change out of these clothes, but I want to do this properly. I want to take you on a date, a real one, this weekend maybe." "My boss is taking me on a date," I teased. "Well, I'm resigning," he said. "Or demoting myself, or something. I'm going to have HR realign our reporting structure so I'm not technically your boss anymore. I'm an immortal corporate entity who can restructure his entire organization to avoid conflict of interest, so this is happening. Only you would solve a relationship problem with a reorganization plan. I'm very efficient, he said. Also, I think I'm supposed to invite you to dinner and compliment your eyes or something. I haven't done this in about 80 years. Your eyes are pretty great too, I offered. He kissed me before leaving, which seemed like a natural conclusion to a night that had started with him swimming in the East River and confessing to being a 300-year-old vampire. It tasted like the coffee he'd been drinking, like nothing, like everything, like possibility. 3 months later. The truth is that vampire romance requires a lot of logistics. Explaining to HR why your boss was restructuring your reporting line, while simultaneously asking you out, was complicated. Dealing with the fact that he couldn't go to normal restaurants during the day because the sunlight made him deeply uncomfortable was inconvenient. Learning that he'd actually been in love with me since the second interview, when I'd asked him intelligent questions instead of just nodding along with everything he said, was either heartwarming or terrifying depending on the day. But we made it work. Adrian was still Adrian, brilliant, driven, occasionally cold to people who weren't me, but he was also this other thing, tender, considerate, surprisingly funny when he let his guard down. He'd lived so long that he had perspective on everything. When I freaked out about a project at work, he'd remind me that I'd survive it regardless. When I felt insecure about the age gap, even if most of it was him not aging, he'd simply hold my hand and tell me that he'd chosen to stick around for this for me, and he didn't make bad choices. We moved in together after 3 months. He sold his sterile minimalist apartment, and we found a place that had a bedroom with blackout curtains and a kitchen where we could make mistakes together. He turned out to be a genuinely terrible cook, which was hilarious because everything else about him was perfect. One evening, about 6 months into our relationship, I finally asked him about the photograph on his desk. That, he said, turning it face up with careful fingers, is me, from about 150 years ago, before I decided I was done being sad all the time. The photograph showed a younger-looking Adrian, or someone who looked like a younger version of him in sepia tones. He was smiling genuinely, the way he now smiled at me. You were gorgeous then too, I said. I was, he agreed, but I'm better now, better because you made me remember why living forever could be worth it. The thing nobody tells you about falling in love with someone who's lived forever is that it makes your own life feel more important, not less. Adrian had spent 3 centuries chasing business deals and accumulating wealth. In 6 months with me, he'd done things he said he'd never done before, laughed so hard he cried, admitted he was afraid of something, danced in the kitchen at 2 a.m. while drunk on red wine. One night he sat up in bed suddenly. What if you leave me? He asked. I'm not going to leave you. But what if the novelty wears off? What if 20 years from now, I'm still exactly the same and you've aged a decade and you realize you made a mistake? What if I'm genuinely just too old and too broken and too much? I turned on the bedside lamp to see his face. Adrian looked genuinely panicked, which was rare. Powerful Adrian Blackthorne, who'd built an empire and survived centuries, was afraid of the one thing he couldn't control. Then we'll deal with it, I said. Together, that's what people do. They stay and they work through the hard stuff, or they leave and life goes on, but you don't get to make that decision for me. You did that once already, 3 years of loving me in silence and deciding what I could handle. I'm asking you to trust me now. He pulled me close, his cold arms around me warm enough anyway. Okay, he whispered, I trust you. The next morning he took a day off work, something he'd never done in the 5 years I'd known him, and we just existed together. No grand plans, no romantic gestures, just coffee and conversation, and the kind of ordinary moments that used to feel boring but now felt miraculous. By the time a year had passed, Adrian had done something nobody expected. He'd hired a new CEO to run Blackthorne Industries and stepped back to consulting. He said it was because he was tired of the same game. I knew it was because he wanted a life that included me in more than just the margins. We got engaged on a Tuesday. Adrian proposed with a ring that he'd designed himself, and when I asked why he'd chosen Tuesday, He said it was because that's when I walked into his office 3 years ago and ruined him for anyone else. You've never ruined me, I corrected. You fixed me. Semantics, he said, and kissed me. The wedding was small, intimate, held in the winter garden of a private botanical facility that Adrian owned. Jessica was my maid of honor, Adrian's best friend, a human woman named Margaret who'd known him for 40 years and was apparently an exception to his "don't get close to mortals" rule, was his best man. When they pronounced us married, Adrian pulled me close and whispered, 300 years and I was waiting for this. For you, best decision I never made. And I understood then, understanding the truth about Adrian, that he was immortal, that he'd loved me in silence for years, that he was fundamentally different from anyone I'd ever meet, that hadn't made him scarier, it had made him realer. Most people spend their whole lives wondering if they're enough for the people they love. Adrian had spent 300 years wondering the same thing, but sometimes, if you're lucky, you find someone who makes you stop wondering. You find someone who looks at you and sees all of you, the ancient parts, the broken parts, the parts that are still learning how to live, and loves you anyway. That's what I'd found in Adrian. And 300 years later, he was still finding that same thing in me. We had a lifetime to figure out the rest. He showed up drunk at my door to confess he was a vampire. I opened it anyway. Sometimes the scariest love stories are the truest ones. If this story touched your heart, you're going to love what's waiting on my Patreon. Get access to exclusive stories, character backstories, alternate endings, and join a community of fans who can't get enough of supernatural romance. Your support helps me create more magic. Link in bio.